Hello and welcome to Resistance TV. Tonight we're looking at how the UK government forcibly sent 150,000 kids abroad between 1920 and 1967 to what they described as whiten Australia and Canada. Now, the former Labour Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, did make a formal apology, but only after the Australian government issued an apology first. In a breathtaking, I think can only be described as a breathtaking understatement anyway, Gordon Brown said the programme was, in quotes, misguided. But it was considerably worse, in my opinion, than merely misguided. I mean, this was a deliberate and heartless assault against vulnerable working class kids. They were cut off from their families, and some were even told that they were orphans, which was just a barefaced lie. Incredibly, no UK government officials were ever charged, let alone convicted, for what can only be described as a crime against humanity. So joining us this evening to discuss this despicable chapter in Britain's history is Mick Napier. Mick's perhaps best known as the founder of the fantastic Scottish Palestine Solidarity campaign. But Mick, perhaps you could just start by saying, why this is an issue about which you feel particularly strong. I mean, I think it's an issue that obviously all right-minded people would feel strongly about, but I think you've got a particular interest, haven't you? So perhaps you could open up by just giving us a bit of background.
Perhaps, Chris, I could explain why I've got three particular interests in this.
Yeah, of course.
I've got a Canadian passport, by the way, and a couple of Canadian children. You may have heard last year how the Canadian government admitted that the hundreds of bodies that were dug up from, Indian schools, from schools for First Nations, hundreds of bodies in mass graves and many schools dotted across Canada, that the Canadian did this amounted to genocide, and they don't challenge that label. It was a specific attempt to disappear the First Nations people by forcibly assimilating them into whiteness or Europeanness or something like that, forbidden to speak their own languages and so on and so on. I'm also involved in the issue of Palestine and therefore study Israel fairly closely. And there's an anniversary coming up in quite a few days' time, actually, when an Israeli government minister, Hanegbi, I think it was 2016 actually, yeah, 2016 it was, announced on national TV what many, many people already knew, which couldn't be concealed any longer, that 5,000 Yemeni Jewish kids who had been coerced or made or wanted to emigrate to Israel after 48 had been disappeared, had been snatched from maternity wards, had simply gone into hospital and never gone home. And those 5,000 children were adopted by European Jewish families to whiten them, because that was seen to be a good investment in the state of Israel. Oriental Jews and Balkan Jews as well were seen as inferior and really a major problem for the state at that. So that was a huge scandal, and nobody challenges that in Israel. It's public domain. Mm. But that, horrific though that is, that the mothers were told their children were dead, the children were told their mothers didn't want them. Agony ensued, multiplied by thousands. You imagine the horror of being told that your mother's dumped you because she just does, and you find out later that the case. So that was a huge, horrific story, but it pales into insignificance when you look at what happened in Britain. And Israel is a settler colonial state with all the brutality and ethnic cleansing involved in that. But far too many people think that it's so unique, it's the kind of devil's spawn and it's unique on the planet and so on. They don't see the commonalities between that state, anachronistic, it's still a colonial state, and the other white supremacist states, the other colonizing states based on white supremacy, like Britain, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and so on. And I think it's important to look at what happened in Britain, because Gordon Brown apologized. I think he indicated he was going to apologize a few days before the Australian Prime Minister said that he was going to apologize, and that's because the lid was coming off the story. By the way, Chris, have you ever seen a film called Oranges and Sunshine?
No, I don't think I have actually.
It's got some familiar faces in it and some brilliant actors.
Yeah.
I think it's Hollywood, but it's absolutely wonderful story of a Nottingham social worker, Margaret Humphreys. You don't get a lot of Hollywood movies about Nottingham social workers, although we should have more.
Well, I agree.
Well, she began, but it's so important, you know. You think from a British platform, you think of Margaret Hodge, MP, who actively covered up and besmirched whistleblowers of sexual abuse, massive industrial scale sexual abuse in the London borough that she was head of. Yeah. And how she had to pay damages when this guy turned out to be no pushover. He became a barrister despite his horrendous experience in one of her homes. Yeah. And you compare Margaret Hodge with Margaret Humphreys, a Nottingham worker who began to force the British government, it's from below, to acknowledge the crimes that had taken place with this forced emigration of UK children to Australia, Canada, Rhodesia, South Africa, and so on. And you know, and the story is one of a much greater scale. The numbers you've given, 130,000 in just under 50 years, are not challenged. And there again, you know, working class kids, vulnerable kids, were told in some cases that if their parents were in real trouble and they were put in institutions, they were told that they could go to Australia, oranges and sunshine. They could go to Canada. You know, it's an adventure, and the children there go to school on horseback. You know what kids are like. And when they got there, they were enslaved. They were taken in trucks in Australia to remote outback places, and they were used as labor. And the cruelty of because Margaret Humphreys from Nottingham began by contacting the survivors in Australia and bringing them back to try to reunite them with their families, began to tell the stories. And it was absolutely horrendous, you know, and nobody's gone to prison in Britain. Nobody has been charged. Nobody's been shamed. Nobody's been named as the culprits in this. And it was mass abuse of tens and tens and thousands of children. The witnesses who came back and gave evidence to the inquiry into child sexual abuse, one researcher estimated that just in one school alone, Australia, in a place called Malong, 60% of the kids were sexually abused. 160 kids are survivors, adults. In Australia, took out a case against the main British institution that was promoting this project. So yeah, it's really grotesque. It was there to avoid the expense of putting working class kids into care homes.
No, indeed.
Yeah, send them to Australia and whiten. When you go,
it's a form of class war, isn't it?
Naked class war. Naked class war. And I you know, no rich people were the subject of this, were the object of this. It was entirely poor and vulnerable kids. And by the way, my own personal anger stems, Chris, because I was born in 47, and this program was at its peak. And my biological mother, you know, the war, the carnage of the war, her husband had died in Burma. She'd given birth to me in 47. It was a tremendous shame at that time to have a child out of wedlock. Women, some young girls were put in mental asylums.
I know they were.
I mean, utterly horrendous.
Well, Mick, I worked in a local hospital in Derbyshire, not far from where I live, called Aston Hall, and there were people in there who'd been entirely institutionalized, and they'd been incarcerated in there. I mean, I was probably working there in the 1970s. And they'd been incarcerated there from about the late 1920s, 1930s, simply because they had a baby out of wedlock. I mean, this is just a horrendous treatment of working class people that we saw. And this was this transportation of children that we're speaking about this evening. You know, yet another manifestation of that class war. I mean, do you see echoes of that type of class war today? Do you think, you know, that we could see other abuses of working class people emerging? Indeed, you know, working class people are, and in many ways are, being under sort of constant barrage, etc. But do you see? I mean, this was particularly egregious. Do you see the potentiality for something comparable in the future?
Somebody said if you looked inside the usual British prison, you would want it to be shut down. And I think children's homes, I've no experience of that. To just go back to one thing you said there, Chris, we were talking about, an Edinburgh social worker pointed out a care home in Edinburgh where an old lady had died recently who had been incarcerated there as a single mother when she was just a teenager, I think, or just barely out of that. And I heard the same stories when I lived in Nova Scotia as well. So this major problem of how girls and women were treated who became pregnant outside wedlock. But what then happens to the poor? They're treated in a shocking way. Everything is done on the cheap. Social workers who should be looking after vulnerable children don't have the time, they don't have the resources to do so. Scandal after scandal hits the headlines of terrible, stories that break your heart to even think about them. And it comes back to cuts. They're looking at the caring for working class children whose families are unable or unwilling to look after them is not a priority in this system. It doesn't get financed. It's grudgingly financed, and the social workers are always pointing out the consequences of this. And then again, you get a wretch, a low life form like Margaret Hodge, who actually attacks the whistleblowers who try to shine a light on grotesque, long-term, massive sexual abuse in a particular London ward. There's no reason why we should think that particular London ward is exceptional.
I mean, social service. I worked in social services for a period. Indeed, I trained as a social worker. But as far as I can tell, social work has just been a consistent failure through the decades. It's particularly difficult now because, as you say, massive cutbacks, and social workers have got ridiculously long, massive caseloads. Very difficult to just sort of keep pace. Many people fall off the agenda, don't get any input, any support at all. But one of the things that really struck me when I was working in social services, Mick, was the fact that there were social services interventions, and it was predominantly with working class families, but there was a kind of intergenerational thing. What was a social work intervention achieving? Because what we were seeing, because I worked as a social worker for a bit, and then I was a welfare rights officer, but we saw the children. My late wife, she was always senior social worker actually, but we saw the families, the children of families who'd had a long-term sort of social services intervention. And that's not just a failure, I think, of social service, but that's a failure of the way in which we organize society, isn't it? Because nobody, in my opinion anyway, should be in that sort of situation long term, let alone intergenerationally in that sort of situation, needing input from social services. And I think to a large extent, there are other aspects, poverty, mental ill health and so on, but I think the common denominator was poverty. And we're not doing enough, are we, to tackle poverty? And I suspect, just going back to what the original focus of our conversation tonight was about, was these were, as you say, working class kids from very poor backgrounds, and we're seeing a kind of, it seems to me, maybe we're not transporting kids overseas in the way in which we did back then, but we're still massively failing, aren't we, young working class people?
Well, I don't want to bang on too. You're a social worker. You've experienced as a social worker. I've only heard anecdotal evidence from friends and comrades that I knew. So I'll certainly defer to you on that one, Chris. But the problem is that when scandals should be exposed, they're covered up. Now, Hodge is an example, of course, and that is absolutely undeniable. But in the stories that I started off telling here about the forced forcing of very poor, vulnerable working class children to Australia, it was known, there was inquiry after inquiry, which unearthed terrible stories of abuse. sample for in the sort of primary, the major Catholic Church was organised, Barnardo's, the Methodist Church, the Church of England, they were all involved in this terrible, terrible scheme. And all of them bought into the need to whiten the colonies. It was a nakedly racist project. But when evidence was unearthed of terrible abuse, it was covered up. It was covered up. You know, members of the clergy, political figures, members of the royal family, the Duke of Gloucester, endorsed this particular, organisation for the promotion of emigration. And so they actually had some, because these groups have honest people within them, they're not all diabolical, it's the system, not the people. And so when there were inquiries and they unearthed terrible abuse, they actually drew up a blacklist of institutions in Australia to which they should not send children. But they did, they kept on sending them. The blacklist was covered up because the priority was whitening Australia and getting rid of these people who were the scum, who were the lowlifes as far as these people were concerned from the slums of Britain. These were people whose lives were not worth very much. That's why they were lied to. And you know, Chris, they were lied to and told their parents were dead. The parents were told that the children had died sometimes. And then later, these children were then subjected to a regime of abuse over many years, thinking their parents had sent them there. So they were often subjected to physical beatings, but there was the mental agony of thinking, why did my parents send me here? But the parents were often lied to. The parents were told the kids can come back if they don't like it, but the children were on a one-way ticket.
No, indeed. And the examples of children forcibly really removed from their parents because they were single parents and all those other things that we've spoken about. But the point that you made there, Mick, about people saying, oh, well, we'll draw up a blacklist and we'll make sure that we don't send kids to those institutions which are deemed to be dangerous. But it was the whole premise upon which they were basing that decision was utterly immoral, wasn't it, to kind of transport kids in the first place? Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's kind of, what kind of warped thinking was going on to say, well, we'll keep sending the kids, but we just won't send them to these places where they're being abused. I don't know whether that's a sort of a colonial mentality, the empire, the sort of imperial mentality or what, and certainly, as we've said, a class war, this class hatred thing going on.
It was very clearly expressed, Chris, that they were a source of cheap labor. They were sometimes sent to the outback to build Catholic churches. They were sent to, locations where most Canadian or Australians would not want to go. And it was very clear they were a source of cheap labor. And in fact, what happened was the institutions in Australia drew up requests that were sent back to Britain for a specific number of children of a certain age and a certain gender. Now, you have to pause about the horror of that there was that institution in Australia saying, send us so many boys and girls. And when they got there, they were being systematically abused. And any attempts to blow the whistle on that were being suppressed. So, there's all sorts of decent people inside the system who try to ameliorate and try to improve things. But up against cheap labor, up against an imperial drive to whiten Australia, I mean, there were voices in Australia who were welcoming these children, some Archbishop of Perth, for example, and he said, thank you for coming. This is wonderful. We're threatened the Asiatic races, right, who are very near us. It was this program, look, hey, when I grew up in Glasgow, you could travel to Australia for 10 quid.
Oh, right? I remember.
The Aussies called them £10 poms.
Poms, yeah, absolutely. My mum and dad were talking about potentially being £10 poms themselves, mate. It did decide not to go in the end, but I know a lot of people
absolutely
that option,
to whiten Australia. Black people, the black people who lived in Glasgow need not apply. Brown people who were coming there need not apply. This was absolutely racist, and it was very clear. Send us good British stock was the word. It meant white people, and there were no black people that who could possibly be sent there. So it was really horrific at several levels. It was a social war in Britain to save money why look after these children in homes, which, however horrible, still have to be paid for, when you can use them as cheap labor in Australia, and you're actually carrying out a racist agenda at the same time. And that racist agenda is financed by the government, because there was there were private institutions with royal and other patrons, but the British government passed a law, and then they began to finance this operation, which of course gave it credibility and prestige in the eyes of some parents, who, when somebody came and said, look, you're so poor, your children are in a home at the moment, why not just send them to Australia? They'll be happy, it'll be lovely, there'll be sunshine and oranges and going to school on horseback and so on and so on. So it was this atmosphere. Chris, you remember when asbestos was discovered to be absolutely lethal?
Yes.
The fact that it was ubiquitous meant that people didn't believe their ironing board was a threat, was a dangerous thing in their home. The ubiquity of it somehow carried it along. And that was the case for this project. Only very few voices were raised against it, because only very few people knew the horror of what was happening in the destination colonies.
What did you make of Gordon Brown's fairly mealy-mouthed apology, Mick? Was hardly a fulsome apology, was it?
Well, the first thing, before you look at the content, Chris, which is worth thinking about, was the timing. This had been going on since before the war. It was still, it reached a peak, I think, in '69, and it was only terminated in the 70s, 68, then it ended in '72. Thousands of families were in Australia and beginning to make their voices heard. Margaret Humphreys had begun to raise the issue in Nottingham, and then Gordon Brown comes along and apologises. But he apologised when he was left with no choice, because Kevin Rudd must have got in touch with him and said, I'm going to apologise on behalf of the Aussie government. And then just before he did it, Gordon Brown announced that he was going to apologise later. He did so several months later. But I come back to this. Why was there no, public inquiry? Why was this not treated as a grave crime against humanity, working class, vulnerable humanity? And why was it just an apology and some money, and nobody was held accountable?
Well, presumably it's because it was a mainstay of the establishment. It was an establishment project, and the establishment are rarely held to account for their misdeeds. In my view, I don't know whether you would agree with that, Mick.
No, that's simple. In science, a very basic theory that explains everything is a strong one. And what you've just said explains so much. Look at Grenfell. How many years is it since Grenfell? Nobody's yet been charged or gone to court, as far as I know. There might be charges, but it's still just a big might. The establishment has got moats and ditches and fences to protect itself, so that even when a story comes out, there can be delaying tactics.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, just on the Grenfell question, I was a shadow fire minister when Sir Martin Morbick was appointed to chair the inquiry, which was very controversial, and the local community were opposed to his appointment because he was seen as an establishment stooge. I mean, he'd presided in a number of high-profile cases, legal cases, and had invariably come down on the side of the establishment in that sense, and had actually been overturned at the Supreme Court. And I sort of spoke out against that, but there were forces inside the Labour Party who moved against me. Never mind, the Tories or officialdom in the sort of inner reaches of the establishment. I mean, it was key figures in the Parliamentary Labour Party that were moving against me, saying, "Oh, we can't say that. It's not up to us to determine." I was trying to say, well, I thought it was, under Jeremy Corbyn, this was a new type of politics. You know what I mean? Straight talking, honest politics, and we should be on the side of working class people. But no, I mean, they just no, that was just unacceptable. To sort of take that angle. So, the influence of the establishment and the cover-ups, it's very, very deep, and it's a cross-party thing. It's not, like sort of like, Labour will come out on the side of the people against the establishment, it seems to me they are very much part and parcel of the establishment. And that whole thing around Grenfell, really brought that home to me. But I just wanted to just sort of make another point, Mick, and be interested in your thoughts on this. I mean, you talked about, various inquiries and stuff, and there's, been on this particular scandal, very little done, a mealy-mouthed apology, some compensation, but nobody really held to account in that sense. But, where there's been other, just in terms of social services, children's social services, and I think you alluded to this in some of your earlier remarks this evening, Mick, there's been some horrendous incidents, things that have happened. And there's been various inquiries, and people, talk about learning the lessons, but the lessons never are learned, because these tragedies just keep happening, and it comes back, it seems to me, to there's a structural problem in the economy and society, and it comes back to this whole thing around class war, doesn't it? Where we have these various inquiries, the baby P inquiry and all that kind of stuff, but nothing fundamentally changes, nothing fundamentally improves, and things are actually getting worse. I mean, you mentioned the cuts in the provision of public services, the provision of social services, and that has coincided with a massive increase in the incidence of poverty and deprivation. I mean, this is a kind of a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Wow. To start, Chris. I mean, I said, when crimes are unearthed or in danger of being unearthed, or they're whispered by a few people, or one newspaper carries a story about it, they do have moats and ditches of defences. And one of the main lines of defence for the Tory party is the Labour Party. Yeah. I mean, they can be relied upon to take a lot of the heat. They hate each other when it comes to the prime places on the gravy train. They fight that, but there's a massive, overwhelming consensus between the two. So that, for example, if I can bring it back to my main concern, which is the crimes against the people of Palestine. How can it be that, while Britain is sending sniper rifle parts to the Israeli army, which is mowing down journalists, children, the UNHCR says the Israeli army is killing children, knowing that they are children. Yeah. Prominent journalists confirmed this. I'll look at the record, will support that. British juries have found the Israeli army guilty of murdering British men, and including a journalist, David Miller. So sometimes it comes out into the public domain because of the honest men and women of a jury, or even an honest judge sometimes. But there's still an amazing number of blankets to suffocate the story with, so that the crimes continue. And these aren't crimes that you could sit down with somebody and they would argue with you. It's incontrovertible that selling sniper rifle parts to snipers who shoot down unarmed demonstrators day after week is a crime, but it continues. And you have to look at the totality, the whole picture of the defences that these arms companies have. Thank God some young men and women are going up on the roofs now and challenging that.
No, they are. They are. But this class war that we're kind of talking about, and the way in which these working class kids were treated over that extended period of time, and there's still a class war being waged right now, and that's intensifying and getting worse. We're seeing, as I've already mentioned, poverty increasing, precarious employment getting worse, cuts in public services, kind of a perfect storm. The political class not really fit for purpose. So, you've been around a while, Mick. You're a seasoned campaigner. You're an inspiration. I mean, what's to be done? I mean, what can we say to people watching this program this evening or catch up? What can you give people some sort of hope that that it is possible to build an alternative? It is possible to fight back. It is possible to create a better society, because we're going in the wrong direction now. Things are getting, I mean, look, for all of my young life, the lot of, I mean, it wasn't perfect, obviously, but the lot of working class people was on the up. It was improving. Inequality was diminishing. You know, every year a bigger proportion of the national cake was going into the pockets of workers. And it's been going the opposite direction ever since Dennis Healy went to the International Monetary Fund in 1976. I mean, I don't want to sort of, you know, counsel of despair, but you, as I say, you've been a brilliant campaigner. You are an inspiration. I mean, what hope can you give to people? What encouragement can you give to people watching this program about how we can fight back? What can we do?
I mean, just think about Mick Lynch. The fact that, I mean, he wasn't Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn, I think, was very softly spoken, nice guy, but he didn't smell of cordite. He didn't real leadership, and he's going to threaten the opposition with a superior force, in which case a mobilised and organised key workforce. Mick Lynch changed the mood pretty quickly, not because he was very articulate, which he was, but because he was backed up by mass action. But the mass action by itself wouldn't have been enough. You needed that kind of political leadership and somebody who's able to talk about things in a simple way, so that when anybody walks away, they think, why didn't I see that before? It's as obvious as the nose on my face, right? So I think things can change very quickly. And I think in Britain at the moment, we've seen extremes of poverty and wealth. We've seen extreme militarism, you know, a thirst and a lust for war to please the arms companies. And I think there's a, you know, apathy can mean two different things. It can mean I don't care, or it can mean I don't see any way out of this hell that I'm in. And that can change, that latter one can change. And I think Mick Lynch was an example of that. And of course, I mean the railway workers in general as well, with him at their head. So I think the status quo is fragile. The Tories are, there was an opinion poll in Scotland a few weeks ago, Chris. Boris Johnson was hated or despised by 84% of the population, and 12% thought he was doing a good job. God knows where that 12% came from, but you know, there's always some. You know, it's a fragile thing, and they will rely upon the Labour Party at some stage when Johnson implodes or is caught in some other grotesque crime that just crosses a line, or the Tories decide that he's now an impediment. But you know, people need to organise, and I think, you know, small numbers of people organising in each town and city for something when the mood does turn. The mood will turn, you know. And already in my own line of business, my own line of concern, we face a situation where there's militant and unsparing support for Israel among elites, but there's also a crisis in terms of public opinion because the public doesn't go along with that. I don't know what the mood is for war at the moment, but I don't think the great majority of people are going to be prepared to be pushed in order for Boris Johnson to send more and more weapons to fight to the last Ukrainian. So I think a crisis is looming. Workers are facing a real fall in their living standards. Next door neighbour, her oil heating bill has trebled, I think. So people are really suffering, and there's always in a war an initial period when people are confused and demoralised and think that, you know, maybe there's propaganda. Maybe the Germans are evil, maybe the Russians are evil, maybe the Argentines are evil. You know, it takes a while for the fog to clear and individuals to realise they've been conned. And if the body bags don't come home to Britain, there's a hell of a bill coming home to Britain, which working class people are going to be expected to pay. I think that when those bills begin to come through the door, more and more people will be forced to think, is this worth it? Are we fighting for a national liberation struggle? Or is this NATO trying to crush Russia and using the Ukrainians as pawns? And I think you know, it's an unstable equilibrium we've got at the moment, and war is always an accelerator of radical change, but there's hard times to go through before that.
Do you think the challenge as and when it comes, will be led by the trade union movement, or do you think it will be civil society or a combination?
There's no other candidates.
You mentioned Mick Lynch, from the RMT, but I mean, obviously there are lots of other unions.
But there's no other candidate. Sherlock Holmes said, when you rule out every other hypothesis, the one that's left, however unlikely, that's the answer. And I'm not saying it's unlikely, but the political space for debate has been closed down at a national level by Starmer, the Lib Dems, they're all for war, and the Tories. So that political space is closed down. There are groups of people up and down the country who are not happy with what's going on. But as a national political force, it's the trade unions at the moment. But trade unions of the type of the RMT, with that kind of class, with that kind of leadership that knows, by the way, it seems to me that the RMT, the railway workers have got it. They know the miners were massively powerful, but were isolated and crushed, isolated from real solidarity and were crushed. And that the RMT are making an argument, not just to the public going to train stations, but to other workers. Every time Mick Lynch talks, it seems to me he talks about health workers and teachers and everybody else. And I think there's that awareness, dearly bought, that even a powerful group of workers can't win on their own.
I think, frankly, if Arthur, Mick McGahey, and the rest of the miners' leadership had access to the internet, to social media, to YouTube, then they would have perhaps been, be able to, spread their message more effectively. I mean, they were reliant upon the all-powerful corporate media, and we know that they completely misrepresented the miners' struggle. But yeah, I mean, absolutely that. I mean, what the RMT did, and Mick Lynch has been a revelation in terms of, as you say, placing that struggle that the rail workers are engaged in that wider context, I think is absolutely crucial. But the other thing, elephants perhaps in the room, and given that you're speaking to us from north of the border, is potential independence for Scotland, and that might maybe shake up the tree a little bit. What's your thoughts on that, mate? As a potential force for progressive change rather than reactionary nationalism?
Well, up here, the Labour Party was really crushed by the SNP, who, when I grew up, were just always called tartan Tories. The first time I ever heard the SNP referred to, tartan Tories, and they were very right-wing indeed. So Alex Salmond was cast into outer darkness by those three leaders, but they brought him back later to lead the SNP, and he moved it in a social democratic direction. He realised that they had to get working class voters in Coatbridge and Airdrie and Glasgow and Edinburgh and so on, Falkirk and Dundee, and he moved that party to the left. I mean, not radically to the left, but you don't have to go very far to the left to be left of Labour, and that's where he wanted to go. That's where he wanted to go, and working class people deserted Labour in their droves because there was this electoral alternative, which sadly did not exist in England and Wales to anything like the same degree.
No.
So they could find an expression there for social democratic ideas, a better health service, free prescriptions, all sorts of interesting reforms, worthwhile reforms. And Labour was talking austerity, austerity, austerity. Now, where are we now? But you see, Salmond also was against the war in Iraq. He launched a campaign. It wasn't a campaign, but he launched a campaign to impeach Tony Blair, for example. So that was the kind of profile that he cultivated. Nicola Sturgeon a few weeks ago almost called for World War III. She called for daily consideration of a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which ridiculous. Even the hawks in NATO were afraid to talk about because it was just crazy stuff. So the problem is, let me be a little bit cynical. I remember just before the first referendum, which was absolutely wonderfully politicized, and great debates everywhere, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember. I can't stand the character Andrew Neil, right? Horrible guy. But he reported he was in a restaurant in Glasgow, and there was a there was a sort of hen party at one corner of the restaurant, and it went in a tumult, some noise and so on. So he said to the waiter, "What's going on over there?" He said, "Well, they're discussing the referendum and the economics of the NHS." There was a real fantastic politicization, Chris. Where are we now? Hatred of Boris Johnson will only get you so far.
Yes.
I mean, if there were a left-wing government in London, the SNP's roots would begin to dry up. They need the Tories, probably, in London in order for people in Glasgow and Edinburgh to reach for the escape pod. Let's get out of here. And if there's no class politics available to articulate that, then at least it's an escape pod. And I think a lot of people will be voting SNP on that basis. Let's get independence, and then we'll get rid of the SNP and get class.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard a lot of people say that. Socialists have said that. They've got no truck with certainly the SNP in its present incarnation, its leadership, Nicola Sturgeon and the rest of them. They're a bunch of neoliberals at the end of the day, really. And bloody war hawks. I mean, as you say, I mean, it's a crazy bloody rhetoric that they're coming out with. But there is, hopefully, it's not a naive view, but there's this widely held, in my experience, I know quite a few Scottish people where they say, well, look, let's get independence, and then we can sort out the SNP. Then we can, they seem confident, they could get a socialist government elected there. I mean, and Christ, that would be great. I mean, it'd be man from hell might move to Scotland if that were to happen. Certainly, I think it would be a great comparator, wouldn't it, to England? Although even now, I mean, with free prescriptions and tuition and all that kind of stuff, I mean, it's possible to do that, and that's being done in Scotland, and yet, we still see the Tories holding sway in. But mind you, as you say, I mean, and certainly I concur with this. The Labour Party is no real alternative to the Tories. But sorry, Mick, you were just going to say something else.
No, I mean, it's difficult to see the immediate future, except that 10% inflation and much higher for the basic necessities that working class families need, fuel and food. It's much more than 10%. So people are going to suffer unless they fight back. And we can see, movements in that direction, not just the rail workers, but various other very important groups are deciding to take industrial action to defend themselves. So what the reaction to that will be, it's difficult to tell. The Tories can only respond by jingoism, racism, sending refugees to Rwanda, for God's sake, or some other hatred of the foreigner. But the important thing for me anyway is for trade unions not just to fight for their members, but to fight for the weak. We came in here talking about those vulnerable kids who were snatched from orphanages and institutions in Britain and sent off to slave labor and sexual abuse in Australia. Nobody protected them.
No.
The trade unions were not, it has to involve trade unions to protect the strong. Socialism is about many things, but it's the strong defending the weak. And if they're not defending the weak, then we're not actually moving.
No, indeed.
Well,
it comes back to the point I've always been going on about, solidarity, it's so crucial. Working class solidarity, raising political consciousness. If we do that, then we are incredibly powerful. But I guess the underlying message, I suppose, from what you're saying is, people, if they're not already a member of a trade union, join a trade union, get involved in it, and urge that they take on the sort of role that you've just been advocating there. That not just simply about the narrow interest of the workforce that the trade union represents, but that having that wider social, conscience and interaction in terms of the wider good society that we desperately need to create. And of course, the resist movement is moving in the direction of potentially a political party. We're working with the trade unionist and socialist coalition. And so, we're looking to sort of build that, potential alternative electoral vehicle as well. But it's, it's difficult. It's not easy in the sort of electoral system we have in this country. But I don't think we've got any other choice, Mick, because what's on offer from the, the established political class is just, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, two sides of the same coin. But look, we're in the last 15 minutes, and I did say in the last sort of third quarter of the programme we would invite Sean, who's been moderating for us and looking at what people have been saying. And so I'll ask Sean to come in now and see if there's any questions or comments that people have put that Mick might want to respond to.
Hi, good evening. Hope you're all well. Thank you for the people in the chat. We've had a couple of really interesting discussions tonight. On Any Sundry Mule says that in the 1700s and 1800s, people displaced by land enclosure would be expatriated by their wards to mill towns to get the cost of their upkeep off the parish. This is a similar thing that you're talking about, he says. So yeah, I didn't realise it was going on even further back. Did you know that, Mick?
Well, yes. I mean, even earlier, I can't remember, but jobless vagabonds were treated with great cruelty in order to create the modern working class, driven into places where they would compete for employment. But the detail of that, no, I'm not very familiar with, but the general rule that to create a modern working class, you have to terrorize individuals into areas where the dark satanic mills are going to be built and are going to be run. I mean, you don't have to be a Marxist to read Karl Marx to read. By the way, if you've ever read the first volume of Capital, it can be a bit challenging. You know, it's I find it challenging anyway. Maybe your viewers are smarter than me. But the last 6 chapters of the volume about the primitive accumulation of capital, the Duchess of Sutherland gets a mention, but it's about the bloody violent birth of capitalism and how the state used the most atrocious means: branding, whipping, mutilation, expulsion, driving people to Canada and Australia, for that matter, to refer to what we talked about at the beginning, in huge numbers, in order for the system to reach a stage where it became kind of self-generating, if you like. So yeah, it was born out of extreme cruelty, and that extreme cruelty continues. You know, how many families today, Chris, you'll know, have to survive on 1 meal a day in Britain, or have to choose between feeding or buying clothes. Yeah,
it's astonishing, Mick, in the 5th biggest economy in the world. Again, something I constantly rail about, that these are political choices that literally nobody needs to be struggling in this country. And you'll remember, Mick, and again, something else I regularly talk about, when I was a youngster growing up in the 60s, we were told to get ready for the leisure generation, because by the 1990s, we'd all be working like a very short working week of around 15 hours. And indeed, again, something else I've mentioned on this show previously, John Maynard Keynes made a speech in 1930 predicting that his grandchildren, our generation, would only be working 15 hours a week because of the advent of new technology. Well, new technology has come, but it hasn't been for the benefit of ordinary working class people. It's been accreted by, the corporate elites. And again, to kind of keep repeating myself, but something I was talking about when I was on the Democracy Roadshow for the Labour Party when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, to sort of democratise the Labour Party. But we talked about a whole range of other things other than just simply democratising the Labour Party. That was a means to an end, because we wanted to democratise and need to democratise the economy. But one of the points I was making is we all should become 21st century Luddites, because all the Luddites were saying was, well, new technology is fine, but it should be our servant, not our master. And so we are we're in a difficult place at the moment, I think, as a country. Very, very wealthy country, powerful economy that is just making very poor choices, it seems to me, that are having such a detrimental effect on literally millions and millions and millions of people. I mean, what a scandal that people die on the streets of Britain because they're homeless. I mean, it just shouldn't be happening. It just shouldn't be happening, this sort of thing. But we can only challenge it if we do come together. And the sort of work that you've been doing, Mick, I think, and what we're hoping to try and deliver and have been working to deliver through Resist, and there's other groups as well, I think, is to mobilize people and to give them that self-confidence, really, to fight back. We've done it in the past. The working class have done it in the past, haven't we? We've got weekends and health and safety at work, and the sort of things that we sort of take for granted, holiday pay and all the rest of it, equal pay for men and women, etc. These were never given. They were fought for by working class people, by the trade union movement, by the wider labour movement. We forced it. We forced it, and if we just sort of hung around waiting for the largesse of some bloody blue rinse brigadier to look after us, gosh, we'll be waiting a hell of a long time, wouldn't we? I think.
But many of those things have been, they've been trying to take those benefits away from us by creating the 0 hours contracts.
Yes, absolutely.
So there's a lot of people out there. I think I'd like to know the numbers actually and the statistics of how many people do actually work on 0 hours contracts. But you take a day off sick, you don't get paid. No. You don't get holiday pay. You don't get any of those things. So the capitalist system has found a way to work around that, those hard-won things, haven't they?
Yeah. I agree. Sorry, go on, Sean.
No, it's okay. You carry on what you were saying.
No, I mean, absolutely. Well, I was just going to invite Mick to come in and comment on that point. Go on, Mick.
I would say two things. When I was born in 47, 2 years before that, about 1 million men had come back to Britain with guns, and they had been told they were off there to fight the fascists and the Nazis. They were doing that. They were also promoting empire, but that wasn't their personal drive. And when they came back, we got a national health service. We got unemployment benefit. Every morning in my home, we were a very poor family, and we had 4 bottles of milk. Every week we had a bottle of orange juice, and every month we had cod liver oil on the doorstep, right? Yeah. I went to university on a grant, and I had enough to get drunk on a Friday night and still pay rent on a wee flat in Glasgow. Yes, as you said earlier, Chris, life got better. There were several reasons for that, but one certainly was the fear among our elite of those returning soldiers in 45. They were not going back in their box as they were put back in their box after 1918. And even Quintin Hogg made a speech in Parliament saying, you better give these guys reforms, because if you don't, they'll give you revolution, right? A senior Tory grandee. Yeah. So that was the reality, and that's what gave us 6 years of serious social reform. One caveat is this: it didn't go far enough. No, same radical Labour Party of that period supported the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and urged the Palestinians to leave so that European Jews could move in. So there was a blind spot of colonialism and imperialism that any new movement building now that to fight for working class country and to fight with them really has to put
absolutely. Well, Mick, I mean, in terms of what we've said around the resist movement and going forward, as when we were in the process of registering as a political party, that internationalism has to be at the center, really, or a cornerstone, if you like, of what we do. I don't think we can retreat into a sort of, narrow kind of, nationalist sort of mentality. I think it's really important to have that anti-imperialist mindset and to recognize, I mean, I suppose the old marching call, workers of the world unite. I do think there is a lot to be said for that. And that's something that we do need to keep to the fore. And that needs to be very much, in my opinion anyway, part of the whole kind of, political consciousness raising process that we need to go through. But any other comments, Sean, in the last sort of few minutes?
Oh, we were just discussing something called the Fairbridge Society, which one of our members, oh,
hang on, I've just got Mick ringing me. Keep going, Sean. But
one of the people in chat used to work for. So we got talking about that. That was an organisation that was
involved. We lost you, Mick.
That was involved in child migration to Australia and Canada. And it was founded in 1909. It merged with the Prince's Trust, and it didn't actually cease the migration of children until 1981. which I think will probably be quite shocking to some of our viewers. It came as quite a shock to me. They've also been called up to give evidence in the ICSA tribunal which is the investigation into child sexual abuse. Yeah, be interesting to see more about that. But they are now merged with the Prince's Trust. So yeah, sounds like a bit of a dodgy organisation, but they do provide help to children from disadvantaged backgrounds, apparently throughout the UK. So yeah, they obviously were quite dodgy back in their day. One of the other things that you brought up, Chris, was that there was 2 points I wanted to make. You spoke about the Baby P case and social services. Before the Baby P case, there was the Victoria Clambier case, if you remember that, which wasn't that long ago. You know, it was probably back in the 2000s, something like that. And there was an effort by social services and government to change how we work together as agencies, so the schools, social services, hospitals, etc. And I remember being part of a pilot team in Manchester for the multi-agency team called Every Child Matters. And we were changing the way we taught, and we were changing the way we worked together with these other professionals. But it ultimately fell down at the first post because social services would never reveal information about their clients. So even though you were a teacher, you were working with these kids and families on a daily basis and knew them probably better than anybody, you weren't able to help these kids. You could only pass on information. So it sort of died a death. And then you get to the next big social services case where children are let down, and the next, and the next, and the next, and the next, and no lessons are ever learned. I also, the other thing I wanted to point out was CAMHS. CAMHS is an absolutely appalling service that is in crisis in this country. There was a lady on Twitter yesterday who was talking about her child she's in a family of 5, they're all registered disabled, and one of the children had been shipped 7 hours away to a private mental hospital.
Indeed. Well, of course, a lot of this is down to, again, the point that Mick was making, big cutbacks in public services. And I mean, I think the point you're making about collaboration between agencies is really important. That needs to be done better. But even if that was done perfectly, I still don't think it would have worked, because there's no fundamental structural shift in the redistribution of wealth and income in the country. And I think without that, there could be fantastic collaboration. But if you're not tackling the underlying problem, which very often is poor housing, poverty, and a whole host of other problems which are associated with that, the agencies can collaborate till the cows come home, but they're not, if we're not as a society, if we're not as a country, they're tackling the root cause, which is, poverty. I mean, I know there are problems when you've eliminated poverty, but let's sort that out, and let's have that collaboration and proper resourcing of public services. But so
Labour made a start with that, with the Sure Start, didn't they?
They did, but again,
it could have gone a lot further.
It should have, absolutely. I mean, Sure Start was a fairly decent initiative. But again, I mean, let's not forget, inequality got worse under New Labour, and they never addressed the fundamental underlying problem, and that was neoliberalism, which is a violent ideology, that's wreaked havoc throughout the world. But Mick, we're right at the end. We're in the last minute. I don't know if you got any final comments. And as I mentioned at the outset, you're famous for founding the fantastic Scottish Palestine Solidarity campaign. Is there any way in which people can, make contact with the Scottish Palestine Solidarity campaign, or get in touch with you? Is there a contact number or email?
Hey, Chris, thanks for the invitation. Resistance TV is inspiring. People resisting is inspiring. Railway workers resisting is very, very inspiring. We have to come together. If anybody wants to get in touch, just Google Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We do a regular daily post, and we also do, which Chris gets, and we also have a we're launching a new magazine. Well, we've got the second edition coming out of a new magazine that tries to provide a framework for solidarity campaigning. But thanks for the invitation, Chris. It's always a pleasure, mate.
It's great to see you. Mick Napier, thanks for coming on this evening, founder of the Scottish campaign, Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Really good to have you. Thanks everybody for watching this evening. We'll see you next week. Good night.